Hello everyone, this is the final video for Activity 3.4 Dead Zones Part 3. We will be covering pages 84 through 86 in your handouts. So in the previous video we completed step 4, which was creating an explanation tool, and we will keep going with step 5. So step 5 says, with your group, look at the graph on the left and discuss the following. A. What pattern do you notice in this graph? First, whenever you need to work on a graph, the first thing you need to do is check the labels. So on the x-axis we have timeline, time period, year, and on the y-axis we have size of dead zone. So the question is asking, what pattern do you see? And if we look at the data, you'll see that from 1985 to 1988, dead zone decreases, and then 89 to 95, it increases. There is still some drops, and it drops again, it increases, and during 2000 the size of dead zone drops dramatically, and then next year it increases dramatically too, and then it decreases again, it increases, drops, goes up, same thing happens here too, goes up and starts dropping again. So in this graph we don't actually see a clear pattern. So it's not like the size of that zone decreases for 3 years and then increases for 3 years, and then it decreases again for 3 and increases again for 3 years. We don't see such a pattern. So what we can say, what is the pattern? We can say that the size of that zone is not stable and it is changing. So we can say size of the dead zone is not stable. It is changing, and there is no clear pattern. So step 5b says, do the data in the graph match the prediction you made in step 3 about patterns in the size of dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico? So let's remember what was step 3. What was step 3? We covered this in the previous video. So step 3 is here, and during step 3, in step 3, we answered the question that I just highlighted, which was, what pattern do you expect to see in the size of dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico? Explain why you expect to see these patterns. So again, before we start, quickly check the labels. We have timeline on the x-axis, and we have two y-axes in this graph. The one on the right shows average water flow, the one on the left shows total nitrogen input. And if you remember from the previous video, we said that as water flow increases, size of dead zone also increases. And also, if the water flow decreases, we can also see that the size of that zone decreases. So it says, if we go back to the question, do the data in the graph match the prediction you made in step 3 about patterns in the size of dead zones? It does, we can say, because the size of that zone is not stable. It is decreasing, increasing, so it's not stable. So we can say that it's not a perfect match, but we can say that there is some sort of correlation. They kind of match. Okay, step 6 was completing the reading on the next page. So let's take a look at this short reading. Let's remember it. So, Gulf of Mexico dead zone. The Gulf of Mexico is one of the largest and most important areas for fisheries in the United States. The area where the Mississippi River drains into the Gulf waters is the location of the largest recorded dead zone in the United States, and this dead zone reappears nearly every summer. So if you remember, I asked you a question which was why it reappears nearly every summer. And if you remember our discussion, we said that spring, summer, that's the time period that we start growing crops. So it means that we use lots of fertilizer, and it rains, it washes away the extra fertilizer. So this is the reason that this dead zone reappears nearly every summer. If you look at the images we have, let's read the caption first. These maps show the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico in winter left and summer right. The colors indicate how much plankton is present. Red represents high levels of plankton. The one on the right, it's the summer picture. Orange is slightly less plankton, yellow is less than orange. And green means even less, and it's light blue and darker blue. So the next paragraph is the Mississippi drains nearly 41% of the land in the United States, and a lot of land is farmland where fertilizers are used. There are also many sewage treatment plants along the river that discharge treated waste that is high in nitrogen. Scientists estimate that 65% of the nutrients that drain into the Gulf of Mexico come from farms and livestock production along the Mississippi. So there are a few important things that we need to highlight. The first thing is the Mississippi drains nearly 41% of the land in the United States, and that's almost half of the United States. So you can imagine that there is lots of farmland here, and we use lots of fertilizers. And also, this is not the only source for fertilizer. Also, many sewage treatment plants are which are trying to clean the water, but even after you are done, when they release that water, it still is high in nitrogen. And scientists estimated that 65% of the nutrients that drain into the Gulf of Mexico come from farms and livestock production. Okay, so sort of nitrogen and total nitrogen from source. So fertilizer and treated soil still has the highest percentage, 50%. Animal manure is 15%. Other factors like atmosphere, groundwater erosion, runoff 24, and factories and other buildings, their contribution to total nitrogen is 11%. So it's not only the farmers, it's not only the farmland, but definitely most of the nitrogen is coming from farmlands. Scientists are concerned about the effect of this increasing dead zone on the fisheries in the Gulf, especially because several of the fisheries are already considered overfished or in danger of becoming overfished. So after this discussion, if you remember, we also talked about this question. With your class, debate the question, should fertilizer use be limited to help prevent dead zones? Should fertilizer use be limited to help prevent dead zones? And um, if you want, you can stop the video here and write down your thoughts about this. But in class, we said that definitely there must be some sort of limit, just like fishing limit, because um, the rain is washing away too much extra nitrogen. And as we discussed also, nitrogen, the fertilizer, it's not cheap. So it's kind of waste of money. You are giving plants more nitrogen than they need. It's not helping you technically, and then worse, it's washed away into the nearest streams and rivers, ends up in the Gulf of Mexico, and creates dead zones, which impacts other people's lives. So definitely there should be some sort of limit to fertilizer usage. We said we cannot definitely stop using fertilizer at all, but limiting it would be a good step or action to take. So, okay, we shouldn't be seeing this part yet, but it's okay. So what are the abiotic and biotic factors that are affected in the dead zone? How do they differ from a healthy ecosystem? So let's start with the biotic things that would be different in the dead zones and in the healthy ecosystems. So biotic means, as you can remember, it means living. So how living things differ in dead zones and healthy ecosystems. Phytoplankton. Phytoplanktons are going to be definitely more in the dead zones because, as you know, nitrogen runs into an area, it's nutrient for plants, so phytoplanktons are plants, so they use all the nitrogen and then grow dramatically. Their growth increases dramatically. So lots of phytoplankton in in, let's say, dead zones, in the dead zones, but in healthy ecosystems, in healthy ecosystems, they are less. So bacteria, when this phytoplankton dies, the bacteria is going to rush into the area, so we will see a lot of bacteria in the dead zones, but in healthy ecosystem there will be less. Fish, definitely we call these zones dead zones because there isn't enough oxygen for many organisms to live, so definitely less fish. In healthy ecosystem we have more fish. Finally, other organisms, you can think about any other marine animals that you could name. It goes for them to that zone, meaning that there isn't enough oxygen so to live, so there will be less other marine animals, but in healthy ecosystem there will be a lot more. Okay, abiotic things. Abiotic means non-living. So what non-living factors that would be different in dead zones and healthy ecosystems? Oxygen levels. Okay, dead zone and healthy ecosystem. Oxygen levels, definitely in the dead zones we have less oxygen, and in healthy ecosystems we have more. And the amount of nitrogen, definitely nitrogen, as you remember, as you know, nitrogen runoff, fertilizer runoff creates the dead zone. So in dead zones we will have lots of nitrogen. In healthy ecosystem we will definitely have less. Okay, the second question was, how might an increase in the size of dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico affect the red snapper fishery or other fisheries in that area? Like all organisms, living things need oxygen. So if there isn't enough oxygen, they don't have much options. If they stay in the area, they are going to die most probably. So their only option is actually leaving the area. When there is not enough oxygen, all this fish, it's not just red snapper fishery, but in other fishery too, fish is going to leave the area, and then we won't have much fish. So definitely it is going to have a negative impact on the fish population and also on the fishermen, because if there is no fish they cannot catch enough to make living. Guiding question. So in every activity, this is activity 3.4, we focused on a guiding question, and for this activity our guiding question was, how do humans affect the size of dead zones? We had many discussions over this. We looked at many graphs, so we can summarize our effect as follows. The effect of humans on the size of dead zones is not entirely straightforward. So what it means by this is, if you remember the graph that shows water flow and nitrogen input, you could see some areas on that graph that water flow increases, but the size of that zone decreases. Normally you would expect it to increase, but there were some areas that even though water flow increases, sometimes size of that zone decrease. And opposite is also correct too. Sometimes water flow decreases, but size of that zone increases. So, but let's keep reading. But there is clearly there clearly is an effect due to human use of fertilizer. That pattern was pretty clear, that fertilizer usage is definitely impacting the size of these areas, dead zones. One more time, it's not entirely straightforward because there are other factors that affect the size of dead zone. For example, temperatures may affect it. For example, weather may affect it. Also, currents may affect it. How much fertilizer is used during that year. Maybe farmers did not use at all, maybe, which is not possible. Maybe they use a lot. So there are other factors that can impact the size of dead zones. That's why our effect on the size of dead zones is not entirely straightforward, but that there is clearly an effect that we cause by using fertilizers.